the big change was right at the end of 2013, but going to 2014, was the arrival on campus of students who were unlike the kids of the boomers. They were much more free speech skeptical. They wanted disinvitations, they wanted new speech codes, they want microaggression policies. And I want to be clear, like normally in social science, distinctions are pretty, they're slow sloping curves of distinctions. This was not slow. This was like lightning hit right around 2013, 2014. Something profound had changed.
So the change, if I've understood you correctly, is that in the pre-2014 era, this is largely a administration-run, administration-led movement. So much so that, like you said, you had students who, when they heard the rules, would actively rebel against them, as 19-year-olds are wont to do. And something shifts in 2013, 2014, where this changes from a administrator-led movement to a administrator and student-led movement. And interestingly, it's happening precisely at the time you wouldn't expect it to happen. If many of things, not all of them, but if many of these cases are coming from the left, then you would think it would happen in a time where you're seeing an increase in conservative ideology or conservative professors, but the exact opposite is happening. So why in 2014 do you think this shift happened?
Well, I wrote a book with my friend Jonathan Haidt. He's a famous social psychologist called Coddling the American Mind. And the whole 95,000 word book is trying to figure out what was so different about these students hitting campus. And we come up with 6 causal threads, as we call them, pretentiously, in the book. And then we even came up with a 7th sense. But I can go through them really quickly.
That'd be great.
And one thing we try to be really clear about, given my own, social economic sort of upbringing, I always want to be very clear. The problems facing the bottom half socioeconomically of the United States, even the bottom 3/4 of the United States, are very different than the problems that we're talking about in Coddling the American Mind. Because one of the things we were trying to figure out what was going on, particularly at the most influential schools in the country. Now, I find it deeply offensive in some ways that we let these schools be so influential for our lives, but even on the right and the left, Josh Hawley and a lot of the top Republicans are also Yale and Harvard, and Stanford graduates as well.
Yeah. Well, and it was really helpful for me when I read your piece in Reason, because one of the things that people do to critique your view is they say, look, there's not that many cases of these free speech codes, of these offensive speech codes happening across the nation. There's 6,000 universities, and it's not affecting that many of them. And you made the point that of the top 100 schools in the United States, according to U.S. News and World Report, 65 have had a professor targeted since 2015. And then you said, meanwhile, the top 10 schools have had an average of 7 incidents each. And why I think this matters tremendously is twofold. It's what you just said. Number one is the most prestigious and the most financially lucrative institutions, their habits, their behaviors, their policies tend to trickle down to the less prestigious and less lucrative universities. And so that really matters for the education.
And to the whole rest of the country.
And the whole rest of our country. And that's the other half, which is that our elite, and some people are offended by that word, it's a simple truth. The people who are going to be in media organizations, the people who are in Washington, the people who are leading some of the most successful businesses, they come from these schools. And so again, there's going to be a trickle-down effect that happens there as well to the rest of our population. So I think it's actually really worthy to say, look, we're focusing on the problems of the creme de la creme of what are often the most wealthy and elite individuals in our society, regardless of their skin color and their sexuality and everything else that might be associated with it. So maybe let's go back to those 6 or 7 things that you saw as causal threads, specifically amongst this group of people.
Yeah, and that's the point I was trying to make, was that those elite schools really matter. Now, firefights cases all throughout higher education, and now since we've expanded, we fight them off campus as well.
Yeah.
But the kind of problems you see at state schools are generally, and you do see some really bad problems in the state schools, they tend to be less ideological. They tend to be more just old-fashioned abuses of power, which also happen all the time as well. So the 6 causal threads, for the type of students who would head to campus, we thought it was interesting that paranoid parenting, there was an uptick in that in the 90s, particularly among the kind of students, and which is ironic because crime was going down, infant mortality was going down, accidental death for kids was going down, partially due to successful safety measures and campaigns that were done in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So it was a great success, but there was kind of a sense that there was no that any digital improvement gets you the smallest bit more safety is worth doing. So we call this mentality, and I always credit Pamela Paretsky, who was our she's a psychologist who was our chief researcher during the book, coining the phrase safetyism, like basically like the idea of like basically the worship of safety, an exaggerated sort of fear of even emotional slights. So paranoid parenting, though probably the one that surprised us the most related to parenting was lack of free play and lack of free unstructured time, which we didn't see coming as we were writing it. But we really do think that if you're scheduled your kids from 6 o'clock in the morning to the end of the day, they don't get the time to get used to the give and take of interpersonal interactions that you desperately need to be an adult. But you also need to be, a citizen in a democratic republic. And we've created so many systems that intermediate conflict for people, in K through 12, in higher education, and for that matter, even the corporate world now with human resources.
It's really fascinating. My father was a high school administrator. And so I actually watched as he experienced in real time during the 2000s and then early 2000s, an uptick of parents who were coming in trying to mediate their child's conflict. And I remember him telling me frequently, your child won't know what to do when they're in real life and they have a conflict and you're not there to solve it for them. Or if you try to solve it, it's going to cause them a major life problem. In other words, they weren't developing emotional resilience. They weren't developing conflict resolution skills that are just fundamental, basic things someone needs to survive in any society. Yeah, no, agreed. And of course, people were always saying, oh, no, the real world will sharpen them up or knock this out of them. And my response had always been like, listen, if enough students are coming out of the elite schools that are wildly disproportionately influential, far more than they should be, it's going to change the real world. And it has, which I think has kind of panned out. So why colleges? There was a mass bureaucratization that I was talking about. There's partially sort of corporatization has something to do with it, but also ideology, like different ideas of ideology, of social justice were promulgated in the early part of the millennium, partially coming out of education schools, partially coming out of the anti-bullying movement. So that definitely, we always nod at like, yes, the wokeness or whatever you want to call it is a real thing. But the thing that we think sped everything up was social media. And social media made trends like polarization we were getting more polarized prior to the real explosion of social media, but it sped things up like crazy. And we think that it's also one of the reasons why you start having really high rates of, and this is the most heartbreaking part, of anxiety, depression, suicide among young people. And the original article that I wrote with Jonathan Haidt in 2015, as someone who struggled, I was hospitalized as a risk to myself. I tried to commit suicide more than once, actually, and in 2007, and I was hospitalized. And after that, it was time to face the fact that I'd get these depressive episodes and they're getting increasingly dangerous. And as I was recovering, and to be clear, just so your audience knows, I took pharmaceuticals. Like I always want to say that because I think sometimes people will hear what I'm saying and say, oh, I can just solve this on my own. I'm like, no, do everything your doctor tells you to do. But the thing that was made the biggest long-term difference was cognitive behavioral therapy. And, if your listeners don't know what this is, it's the most investigated intervention for mood disorders, including anxiety and depression, that exists. And it's this really profound realization of the wisdom of the ancients that essentially reason and rationality can actually make you a happy person, but only if you apply it in a very deliberate way. And this is the insight of cognitive therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, is that when you're depressed or anxious, you have exaggerated thoughts in your heads that can be called cognitive distortions. Sometimes they're catastrophizing, like a date doesn't go well, and you just say to yourself, like, I'm never going to get married, I'm going to die alone, like all this kind of stuff. Or a interview doesn't go well, or actually no, in some cases the interview, you just get off of an interview and you say to yourself, I know that guy hated me. And that's called mind reading. I know that this person, they're definitely not going to hire me. That's fortune telling. And I know if I don't get this job, my career is ruined. That's catastrophizing. There's also things like overgeneralizing, all of binary thinking, that everything is either a 0 or a 1. There's no in between. These are all bad mental habits. And anxious and depressed people
have even more of them. And if you can actually train yourself, and it has to be deliberate, it has to be multiple times a day, sit down and, when you have one of these really exaggerated thoughts that tell you you're broken or you question it, essentially you ask yourself, is this a cognitive distortion? Yes, this is catastrophizing, this is overgeneralizing, these things. And even though it effect feels subtle at first, after a while, the kind of self-talk that I hear in my brain that was really harmful it just didn't sound true anymore, which was amazing liberation. So I saw this in when I was recovering in 2008 on up, and I was like, but what's funny? It's kind of like administrators are teaching young people to catastrophize, to overgeneralize, to engage in binary thinking, to mind read, to do all of this stuff. Oh, emotional reasoning, the idea that if you feel something, it must mean that something else in the world has to change. Sometimes you're just sad. I have a 4 and a 6-year-old, and it's important to understand that.
Yeah.
And my thinking then was, okay, so it seems like administrators are selling cognitive distortions, whether they mean to or not, usually with the best of intentions.
Yeah.
But students aren't buying it. And what the first thing I noticed in 2013 and 2014, when everything started getting really bad with students, is they weren't just demanding new speech codes. They weren't just demanding disinvitations.
Yeah.
They were demanding these things with medicalized rationales, saying that if this person comes to my campus, if I hear this thing, or actually, it's usually not if this other person over there, this unspecified, easily harmed person, it will harm them medically. It will be traumatic for them. They will not recover. And I was like, wow, this is not just bad for freedom of speech. These are cognitive distortions.
Yeah, they're bad for
these
mental
are things
health.
that if you believe them, you're going to feel constantly under assault, constantly depressed. So 2015, we said, this is bad for free speech. This is bad for mental health. And man, free speech has not done very well since then on campus. It's gotten a lot worse, but mental health is the scariest part of all. It is plummeted among young people.
Well, that was going to be my question, and I hadn't thought of this until you started sharing it right now, and you might not be able to answer it, but I want to ask a causal question. Did social media make us mentally unhealthy, which therefore made us more susceptible to cognitive distortions? Or did we have a group of college administrators who trained people in cognitive distortions, which were then spread, almost like a social contagion through social media, which has in turn made an entire generation, my generation, the one underneath me, depressed, anxious, and full of suicidal ideation?
You asked me an or question, and my answer is yes.
Okay.
And for this reason, I think that education schools have a disproportionate influence on younger people because they train who studies in K through 12. And as sweet and wonderful as so many people I know who went to education schools are, they are some of the most ideological schools in there. And They did have this kind of, fragility mindset for young people that you should assume people are fragile and easily hurt, which seems compassionate, but actually really isn't, at least in practice.
Yeah, when
so I
helping
definitely
hurts.
think that some of this stuff, started in ed schools even in the 80s and 90s and became popular there. And that's one of the ways it disseminated. I think another way it disseminated was by response to that also was something coming out of social media and people having young people having telephones on their phones was the anti-bullying, and I'm going to call it this, scare of 2010. And I call it a scare because the cases that were most prominent, including Tyler Clementi, that wasn't about, this was a student at Rutgers who killed himself after his roommate videotaped him in a same-sex encounter, with another man. It's like that's not even legal, like in the state of New Jersey. And he also wasn't a child. This was a college student, so he already did something that was illegal. There was also the Phoebe Prince case, which was a Irish girl in the U.S. who allegedly was bullied to death. Emily Bazelon, who's generally sympathetic to a lot of this stuff, wrote this wonderful book called Sticks and Stones, saying no, it was much more complicated than that. It's not like people don't kill themselves for narratives as simply as people were mean to me. I certainly wasn't at the, about to kill myself because, for simple reasons. And I think that our response to it ended up leading to what we call the 3 great untruths in Coddling the American Mind.
Yeah.
And the way we talk about this is it's as if we're giving young people the worst possible advice that might sound initially kind of persuasive, but is really terrible from wisdom traditions, both Western and Eastern and in between, that are bad ways to think of the world in terms of modern psychology, and also things that we can just say will make you miserable if you believe them. And we call these the three great untruths. The first one is, what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. Play on Nietzsche. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And of course, there's limitations to Nietzsche's original quote, but at the same time, if you tell people that anything that like is difficult for you is going to harm you in some permanent way, that's an awful thing to tell somebody. Always trust your feelings, which sounds cute and sounds like, oh, that doesn't sound so bad. It's like, no, that actually, as nice as initially nice as that may sound, it's actually terrible advice. You shouldn't actually always trust your feelings. You should try to figure out what your feelings are trying to tell you. Because for me, what the thing that makes me the angriest I found in watching the way I think is when I realize that I've done something stupid. Like that's when I'm like, oh, I'm so mad. I'm like, oh, this is usually the way I react when I realize I've done something dumb.
Well,
but
when I hear that idea of following your feelings, as someone myself who's also battled with depression my whole life, I mean, I don't want to be dramatic, but in some real senses, my life depends on me not believing what I feel. Because if I go down that path, if I go down that rabbit hole, I go to a dark place. And so I actually have to question those feelings. And as you pointed out, they often point to something else that I need to dig into, that I need to think about. And so it's a healthy questioning. It's not a discrediting of my feelings. It's an interrogation of them that allows me to go deeper in relationship with other people.
100%. Yeah, Susan David got it. So, I was proud that I could explain that in like a paragraph, and then Susan David did it in like a pithy little phrase, which was, feelings are information, not instructions, which I think is entirely right. Because sometimes you're mad because for the most justifiable reason that someone's trying to take advantage of you, which seems to be these sort of like environment, like evolutionary sort of justification for anger is essentially to defend yourself. And then the last one that I think you'll see all over the place, and I think this one definitely became more popular due to a not perfectly well thought out anti-bullying training, is that life is a battle between good people and evil people. And for most of my life, and my father's Russian Orthodox, so my father would always say things like, there is something beautiful and something ugly in every person, every culture. Like he would talk about kind of like the complexity of people and how the person who's selfish and evil one day can still be, and also in Christian theology can still be redeemed. Yeah. But if it's really it's just good versus evil, and in a hyper politicized environment to begin with, like that's not gonna serve you very well, and you're always going to feel under attack.